Search for Truth 2, Lesson 4, Chart 2. Israel leaves Egypt. After spending more than 400 years in Egypt, the Israelites were headed toward their promised land. Only the 600,000 men over 20 years of age are mentioned. Knowing that the people had rapidly multiplied, they may have numbered from 3 to 5 million. Another feature is noticed about this long marching procession. There was not one feeble person among their tribes. Psalms 105, verse 37. Notice that God selected Israel's route. A cloudy pillar ascended from earth to heaven to lead the host. The pillar of cloud shielded the blistering desert sun. When darkness fell, it became a brilliant column of fire, providing warmth from the chilling winds. Crossing the Red Sea. Once the initial shock of the midnight slaughter had subsided, Pharaoh again changed his mind. Why had he freed those laborers and highly skilled craftsmen? The order was given for 600 royal chariots to pursue and return them to Egypt. As the sun was setting, war chariots were seen coming from the north. Escape was impossible. The sea was on the east, mountains were on the south and west, and Israel was unarmed. Moses lifted his miracle-working rod over the sea. As he did, a strong east wind divided the waters into walls on either side and dried the seabed. The people moved forward in an orderly fashion until all were safe on the other side. As the cloud moved along, Pharaoh's army pressed forward. Again, Moses' hand was uplifted, and the congealed wall of water on either side, Exodus 15 and 8, descended. As the sea returned to its bed, the waves engulfed the struggling Egyptians and horses. Apostle Paul compares this to water baptism, 1 Corinthians 10, 1 and 2. All our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Spontaneously the redeemed nation sang praises unto the Lord. Bitter waters made sweet. Water was found, but it tasted bitter. God instructed Moses to cast a certain tree into the water, and it would become sweet. The healing of these bitter waters was a sign to Israel that God was also able and willing to heal their bodies. Exodus 15:26, I will put none of these diseases upon thee which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. Manna and quail given. After a month they marched towards Sinai. In this barren desert all provisions brought from Egypt were depleted. That evening the sky darkened and an enormous flight of quail fell to the ground about their tents. The following morning they received bread. Until they reached Canaan 40 years later, for 6 days every week Israel received daily bread. The people called it manna, meaning it is a gift from heaven. Before reaching Mount Sinai, the people again clamored for water. This time Moses was told to strike a certain rock with his miracle-producing rod. Water gushed forth as if a hidden reservoir had suddenly been tapped. Law and Tabernacle. In the 3rd month, or about 6 weeks after leaving Egypt, they reached Sinai Peninsula. In this 2-mile wide, well-irrigated plain became Israel's camping ground and schoolhouse for the next year. Here, God gave his laws, ratified a covenant, and provided blueprints for the tabernacle, including a unique way to worship. 12 spies sent. About 16 months after leaving Egypt, the tribe stood at the threshold of Canaan. At Kadesh Barnea, 12 spies or scouts were appointed, a man from each tribe, to closely examine the territory. 40 days later, they returned with tales of highly advanced civilization, fertile land, beauty, and fruitfulness. 2 men brought a large cluster of grapes on a pole to provide the land's fertility. 10 of the men began to enumerate every discouragement they had seen. Vainly, Caleb and Joshua, the other two spies, tried to encourage the panic-stricken people. Unbelief's short-sightedness always sees the difficulties, while faith looks past them and sees God. By nightfall, the whole congregation was weeping like children. Just as they were ready to stone Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb, suddenly the glory of God appeared before the tabernacle. Their leader stood in the gap and prayed for his people. God forgave the people, but none above the age of 20 would enter the promised land. Wandering in the wilderness, the rest of their lives was punishment for unbelief. Brazen serpent. Shortly before the 40 years had expired, the people begged again for water. The new generation seemed as faithless as their fathers. Irritated and exhausted with their unbelief, Moses prostrated himself before the Lord. He was told to gather the congregation and speak to the same rock that had previously flowed. Instead, Moses struck the rock as he had done previously, and water gushed out. But he had disobeyed the command. Because of his unbelief and disobedience, he was prohibited from entering Canaan. Shortly after Aaron died, the people again, tired of heavenly manna, this time there was no miraculous supply fulfilling their request. Instead, they were punished with fiery serpents. When people began dying from bites, they repented and urged Moses to pray for them. A brass replica of a serpent was to be mounted on a pole in the middle of the camp. By looking at the brass serpent, anyone who had been bitten would be healed. Healing power was not in the brass serpent itself, but in obeying God's plan. By looking to our crucified Savior on the cross, we can obtain both healing for our body and salvation for our soul.